Alright, welcome to the 450RL build series that we're going to do here. This is a brand new bike brought in by a customer, and he basically wanted to have a nice, basically pre-runner type bike built. He already has a 450X Gen 2. So he bought the plated version of the same bike, and we're going to tear this thing down in this video and get everything prepped and ready for the build. Starting with suspension here, so getting the rear of it off, and we're going to pull the rear shock and the forks off, and those are going to go up to AHM up in Orange County. These bikes have an airbox lid, so that's coming off there. And the easiest way to get the tanks off of these bikes, or the subframe in this case, either one, is to pull these front 8mm head bolts that I'm working on there. They're kind of tucked up behind the shrouds, but they hold that little black plastic cover over the airbox, which houses the ECU on the front of it. So once you get those two bolts out, this whole little cover, you can see the hooks go around the subframe there. Those come off of either side, and this whole assembly kind of goes up and out of the way. So if you're just pulling suspension off, or even pulling the tank on and off, just pulling those two little bolts and getting that whole assembly out of the way will make your life so much easier. Um, but yeah, you can reach the intake boot here with a good long Phillips screwdriver and loosen the intake boot. And with the exhaust and the plastics off the subframe, you can actually get the whole subframe kicked out of the way. Remove all four bolts, and the shock will come right out. This bike isn't going to be a full race bike build. Um, we're not doing a cam or anything like that. He's not doing full triple clamps. It's just going to be kind of a solid pre-runner build here, as I would call it. But we got the subframe loose there. We got the shock nuts loose, bolts out, and then I missed it in the video, but the shock is out. And then I always like to put that top subframe bolt back in to just kind of hold it in place and keep the intake boot on the throttle body there. So shocked out, and we're going to move up to the front, and we're going to get the whole wheel, front brake, um, computer, everything off the front of this thing. And that will allow us to obviously pull the forks off, and we'll keep kind of tearing into it from there. When I'm disassembling, I will use impact guns quite often. I'll use my little gun here, like a 3/8 for smaller fasteners, like 8mm, 10mm heads, stuff like that. Always use a rubber mallet when you're tapping your axles. Don't mess up those threads. And I've been a pretty big fan of these Milwaukee impact wrenches. They're kind of nice because you can break them loose and then hit the trigger and just run the bolts out. It makes disassembly super fast. I will use some cordless power tools to reassemble things, but I won't do final tightening with them if I'm just running in bolts, pinch bolts on triple clamps, things like that, shock bolts, even linkage bolts. I'll run them down with those, but then always torque them to spec. Um, the 450L and X forks do have you can see that little tab sticking off the front of the fork there where the sensor is for the computer. That is one difference. If you're going to run 450R forks, the lower part of the fork does not have that, so you'd have to do away with your computer. You can unplug those computers, and it doesn't affect anything on the bike electronically or anything. So a lot of people do race bikes. You could also come up with some sort of bracket if you wanted to run 450R fork lugs on an X or an L to retain that odometer sensor. And there's a lot of stuff on these 450Ls that needs to come off. Those reflectors on the lower triple clamp pinch bolts are a good example. And we'll see some more stuff here as we keep tearing down, just to kind of slim them up and make them a little more look like a dirt bike. Right now, I'm just removing all the clamps for the rear brake line because we're going to be completely removing this swing arm. The swing arm's going to get some fabrication done, and you'll see where a little further in the video. The brake line, there's 3 clamps that kind of route the brake line along the swing arm there. So removing all those, they're Phillips or JIS head screws. And these swing arms on these 450Ls actually have foam in them for damping, for, I'm guessing, for highway or some reason to keep the sound or vibration down. But it's a good idea when you have a new bike to remove any of these screws on a swing arm. The chain slider on the left side and the little screws that hold the brake line on the right side, and silicone those because water eventually will get into your swing arm from either riding or washing it, and that can cause problems down the road with specifically your chain adjuster bolts. And I'll show you guys how I prep those further along in this kind of series here. Right now, just finishing removing the rest of the exhaust. So the stock exhaust will not be going back on this bike. We're going to do a pro circuit. We're going to take the right brake pedal out of the way to allow us to remove the swing arm pivot. It's just an 8mm head there, and there's a little clip on the back side of that bolt where it goes through the frame. And then we'll do some prep stuff on that brake pedal when we reassemble as well, just to prevent damage down the road. So these bikes, the 450X and L, also have those plastic covers that you saw come off the right side of the engine case there. Those covers have foam inside of them. They do protect the cases of the motor, but the problem is when you wash your bike or if you ride through water, they actually hold water inside of them and will rust out your bolt heads, and they can kind of cause havoc. So I would recommend removing them. You have to, on the right side, replace 3 of the bolts. You need a 6mm by 30 long, one of those for the right side, and then 2 6mm by 28 long, also for the right side. If you have an older CRF, the top of the hardware is rounded. And then the newer style CRFs, like the Gen 2 450Xs and Ls, have a dimple style head. So if you don't have the newer stuff laying around, you can order them OEM from Honda, or like Bolt Motorcycle Hardware is a great company, and they have all that stuff. You can order individual bolts by sizes on their website or from your dealer. We're going to drain the coolant out of this bike because the radiators will be coming off. They're going to come off and get TIG welded just for reinforcement. Not a huge fan of aftermarket radiator braces. I've seen them protect radiators, but when you fall, that force is going to go somewhere. And if that radiator brace is bolted to something else, like say on a Gen 1 450X, where the coil is, I've seen them actually break the coil tab on a Gen 1 450X. So I just like to TIG weld my OEM radiators, put some mesh screen on the front of the louvers to keep sticks from getting out of there, and I've had pretty good success with that. So that's why the coolant's coming out of this brand new brand new bike here. All right, so let's get these radiators off. I'm gonna pull those front louvers off, and I'll show you further. Oh, drop the radiator cap. I'll show you further down in the series how I prep those louvers. Now I'm gonna move over to the left side and remove the countershaft sprocket guard. That's just a big guard to kind of keep things out of there, keep your boot out of there. You know, the problem with it is it can also hold things in there. So sticks and mud, things can get in there and get bound up. And if it gets super jam packed, it can get behind the sprocket and actually break the case. So I'm not a fan of running those complete covers like that. Um, Now we're going to remove the left foot peg here. The reason for that is we have to remove the entire left foot peg bracket to get the bolts, or on this bike, just the one bolt on the pull rod. The pull rods on these bikes are two-piece. On like an earlier, like Gen 1 450X, it's a one-piece pull rod, and then the bolt comes out the left side. So you have to remove this whole foot peg, left foot peg slash kickstand assembly. And on these bikes, there is a kickstand switch. So if the kickstand is down, they will not start. And further on in the series, I'll show you guys how to bypass that. So I'm just going to remove the whole switch assembly and unplug it for now. Take the bracket out of the frame here, and now I can remove that 10mm head nut off that bottom chain roller, which is coming off there. And the pull rod bolt is basically behind that. Remove the countershaft bolt and get the countershaft sprocket out of there. Yeah, this just allows me to remove the swing arm easier and take the whole chain off with it. Speaking of the chains are not good on these bikes. It's an RK chain. It's an O-ring chain. It's terrible. Mine had O-rings squirting out of it probably in a few hundred miles, 500 miles or less. So I would replace that with a quality like a DID or the DID ERVT is a thin, good quality O-ring chain, and it clears the case well in these bikes. We're just getting the rest of the chain off here and the chain guard, which is not going to go back on. Rear wheel is going to come off. There's also the DID ERV7, which is kind of the race spec chain. They're pretty expensive, but if you're racing or doing some serious off-road miles and don't want to worry about it, I would recommend one of those. If you're looking to save a little money but want a good quality thin chain, the DID ERVT is a good one. And you can get that with a clip or a rivet master link. I always order them with a clip. Order the rivet master link as well. I put the clip one in my tool pack that I carry, and then I install the rivet one on the bike. Since this swing arm is going to go to fabrication, I'm removing everything off of it. So the chain slider's coming off, and I still have the linkage bolted in there. I'll remove that here in a sec, and these are the other three bolts I was talking about that need to be siliconed to prevent water from getting inside of your swing arm. Swing arms are hollow, so water gets in there and eventually will rust your chain adjuster bolts. So not fun. Silicone those and anti-seize your chain adjuster bolts. There's the rest of the linkage coming out. That's out. And now what we do on these swing arms is if you run the stock chain guide, they're fine. But we're going to cut those top tabs off for the little chain guard. But these bottom brackets here are pretty weak. You can see a weld on the front right there, or the side rather, and then weld on the back, and then that rear piece is pretty exposed. So if you run a frictionless chain guide like a BRP or TM Designs, they're pretty strong. Those plastic ones, and it will rip those welds off. I've ripped off two of them myself on Gen 1 450Xs. So this is going to go to fabrication, and I'll show you guys what that looks like when it comes back. All right, so let's finish kind of getting the middle of this thing disassembled. Obviously, get the shrouds off. We're going to be doing a IMS 3-gallon tank on this bike. IMS also now has a 4.5-gallon tank, and they have a big 5.7, I believe, gallon tank for these bikes. Uh, for the longest time, they only had a 3-gallon. That's what most people run for, at least on my 450L. Get about 85 miles or so of range at like a riding pace, not a race pace. So that 4.5 gallon, I think, is going to be a good one to have for get you a safe 100-mile range for longer rides. Left louver coming off, horn coming off. Show you guys how I mesh those louvers with the horn. It can be a little tough, but if you want to retain all of your correct stuff to keep your street legal status, you can still louver or I'm sorry, mesh out the radiator louvers and just do it over the horn. Fan's going to come off. Everything's going to come off these radiators, so they're going to get TIG welded. All the seams will be TIG welded, and all the joints where the hoses go onto them will get TIG welded as well. So taking these radiator hoses off, they have a Phillips on the inside, and the outside is, at least on Hondas, is a 6 millimeter. I used to use a Phillips, pain in the butt. I I just use a nut driver now with a 6 millimeter socket, and it just is so much easier for removing these hose clamps. Um, yeah, that's kind of my tool of choice for removing hose clamps these days. I don't mess with the Phillips on the inside of it, especially for tightening them back down. We're gonna get all these hoses removed off here, and then I have this snap-on coolant hose pick, and it is super nice for working around. You can see me working around the fitting there and kind of breaking the seal that the rubber hose has on the aluminum fitting. There's always a little bit of coolant left in the radiators, so if you don't want it all over the brand new bike and all over the stand or your garage floor, usually have a rag handy for the bottom. All right, so coolant pick that top hose. I'll work it around once, and then usually it's much easier to remove that hose off of that fitting. And I'll actually take these and rinse these out in my garage sink so that there's no coolant left in them, so my fab guy doesn't have coolant dripping out of them while he's welding on them. All right, I'm gonna remove that left engine cover now. And on the left side, you're gonna need one 6 by 28 millimeter bolt to put back in your case here, because the stock bolts are too long. One 6 by 35 and one 6 by 40. And also, when you remove that counter shaft sprocket cover, there's still a little case saver in there, a little aluminum case saver, and you need two 6 by 16 millimeter bolts to bolt that case saver piece back in there. So we're just removing the overflow hose on the right radiator here. This can be a little challenging sometimes. And then we're going to remove the right radiator. And once these come off, I'll actually take the collars and the rubber dampers out of the radiator so that there's no rubber pieces, there's nothing on the radiator when they go to fabrication. And there's also some emission stuff on the back side of this right radiator here. We're going to be removing all that emission stuff off this bike, so you just gotta cut some tape and undo a plug, and you can just unplug it, and then the whole radiator can come off. So it just saves us a step down the road when we're doing the emission stuff. So none of this stuff here on the back of the radiator will be getting reused as far as emissions goes. And that'll probably be the second video where we actually show the steps to install the San Diego Powerhouse thermostat emissions delete kit. Get the rest of our hoses off of this right radiator, and it will come off the bike and be out of our way for now. There's a lot of stuff on these bikes, especially the L's. There's a lot more, obviously, wiring and turn signals and horns and all that kind of stuff. So stripping all that down, and a lot of us basically try to turn these things into 450Xs with license plates, and they're great bikes. Same bike mechanically, just more wiring and things. All right, we're going to remove the engine hangers now. Remove the left one here, and we're going to drill these out. We'll go over that probably in part 2 of this video. Engine hangers are pretty popular these days for replacing them. There's multiple companies out there. You guys probably know who they are, and they make different thickness and different cutouts on engine hangers. I've tried my bike stock. I've tried my bike with aftermarket hangers. Some of those things can be up to, I think, $400 or $500. Um, I found them to be a little too flexy, and it was hard to get the bike to turn and get it to change directions. So I have stock engine hangers drilled, and I'll do that on this bike and show you guys what size to use and where to put it. It's just a lot easier to do it on the workbench than with it on the bike. So we're going to go ahead and get this stock tank out of here. You can see I cut the vent hose for the tank. It's clamped on to the stock fuel cap, so I just cut it, and then that allows me to reuse it on the vent on the IMS tank that we're going to install. So remove our plug, remove our cover for the fuel line connection, pop that little green piece up, or down in this case, and then our fuel line will pull straight off of the barb on the fuel pump there. We'll go over how to install the fuel pump in the IMS tank in a later video. So fuel line's off, tank's off. Now we're going to go ahead and remove the rear fender, which is actually a 2-piece fender on these bikes. So you'll see that in a second here. And then my kid shows up to bother me for a little while.
Marge, stop getting away.
Yeah, I think she was homeschooled from sick that day. Home from school sick that day. So sometimes she comes out to hang out with me. But what we're doing here is we're just disconnecting our tail light, our turn signals, all that stuff. This wiring harness is obviously pretty long, and we're gonna tuck that up under the kind of the subframe area there, like behind the battery, kind of where I'm cutting those zip ties. And you guys will see what we do there, but we're gonna basically cut this subframe and put on a 450X rear fender, with the tail light on the 450X basically functioning as our brake light. And that's going to come from Source Off-Road. It has flush mount turn signals on it and a functioning tail light that functions as a brake light. They come already all pre-wired with OEM connectors and everything, super clean. You basically cut the subframe and bolt the thing right on and plug in your turn signals and tail light, and you're good to go. So all that stuff you just saw will not be getting put back on the bike. All right, let's keep tearing apart the front end here a little bit. You're going to remove the bar mount while the triple clamp's still on the bike. It's just much easier to remove these these nuts here, and then you can see me using a pry bar here to pull these rubber bar mount cones out, and we're not going to reuse those bottom cones. We're going to be using a uh, Scott's stabilizer tower and bar mounts, and for those bar mount nuts and cones to clear the tower that gets clamped on the frame, we have to swap the cones out. And it all comes in the kit. You guys will see it kind of when we're reassembling here in a later video. But it's easier to just take these things out now while the triple clamps are still on the bike. So those are out, and get this bar pad off here. These bars are going to be replaced. And now we're going to loosen the steering stem nut. This is the Motion Pro steering stem nut wrench. It's super nice. It has the wrench on one side for the nut, and then on the other side it has the like a little kind of a hook to do the castle nut that sits under the top trip clamp. So nice to get that loose. It's a 32 millimeter. You could put a socket in there if you completely removed your handlebars, but those are great for getting under the bars and loosening steering stem nuts and tightening them. We're going to get the bars out of these bar mounts here. The bar mounts are going to come out of the triple clamp. We're not going to reuse those because we are going to use bar mounts that mount a Scott's stabilizer to them. So our bars are loose. I'm just going to leave all the controls on for now. I just like to kind of swap the controls when I swap the bars. It's just easier to kind of leave everything routed, while the bike's going to sit here for a little bit while we're waiting on parts and waiting on fabrication and things like that. And also, after the swing arm comes back from fabrication, um, the swing arm pivot bearings will get greased. These bikes are notoriously undergreased. Any bike is. So even on a brand new bike, we're going to remove the swing arm, the linkage, grease that. And right now I'm removing the triple clamps so that I can grease both the upper and lower steering bearings. Here's a little layout of the hardware here, and the parts go into fabrication, and we'll see you guys for part two.